Chapter 1.10, Content and Analysis. So we're going to get into the different types of analyzing artworks. And so far, chapter 1 through 1.1 through 1.9, we've used the elements and principles, and that is formal analysis. It's also called visual analysis, but same thing. So when you're interpreting the works, how it's made, that is formal analysis. But there are other ways that we can interpret work, such as the subject matter and its meaning or content, and we have several different types here. Formal is the one we study so far. I think we all go to the content. We all want to know what it means. So contextual and iconographic analyses are ones that we go to kind of automatically. But there are several other types. So we have a formal, a stylistic, iconographic, contextual, meaning it's made in a religious, historical, social, or biographical mode. So biographical would mean the art about the artist. Feminist analysis, now that is something that has been around for about 40 or 50 years. And it also sort of includes gender studies also somewhat on its own, and psychological analysis. So formal analysis, that is what we've been doing with elements and principles. And we have our lists here. And I think I've mentioned a few times that like pattern is sometimes put into elements. But at any rate, these are the elements of art, principles of art. This is our recipe for the visual elements that are in the work. So when we take formal analysis, we're going to start there in this chapter, and we look at Nefertiti here, we see a triangle that is got two corners here and one corner down here, if you can kind of see that. That is a triangle that exists there. There's also sort of a V shape there, and it's very symmetrical. That's another thing we could say about it. It's got symmetrical balance, and it's got, some colors like this deep, rich green and repeating patterns down here, some of which we have the green, the flesh tone is painted on. This is a really well-preserved piece. I know her ears are missing, but it's quite impressive to think about this thing as being over 3,000 years old, and that it still exists at all, but that it hasn't got as much damage as it could have, and it really has a lifelike presence. It just really amazes me every time I see this piece. But look at the idealization of beauty there, and that's played out with lines. Eyebrows right now look very much like that, and eyeliner, and so on. So she's a bit idealized, but she has a very lifelike quality. Her hairpiece, pattern necklace, they imply texture, although it is flatter. It does really look textured, but it is paint. So it's implied texture. Just remember, when you're talking about texture in a two-dimensional or even a three-dimensional piece, you want to make sure you're talking about implied or actual. Like actual textures like fur or roughness, or but this is actually quite smooth. So we have a directional line in her formal symmetry, implied and directional line. So if we think about the directional line that I spoke of with this angled V right here, some of the implied lines would be some of the facial features, her neckline, and so on. We're going to look at Nighthawks. Now, if you're in the second edition, and I do apologize because I'm redoing these for the third edition, so there's a few shifts here, but in the third edition, this talks about this second edition talks about this as a content analysis about the loneliness, but in the third edition, it talks about it more formally about the contrast and how the contrast leads to the look of isolation. So we see the streets are empty and dark, and we have this bright coloration here, this interior, and the light is kind of coming out here. but you can see a lot of stuff is in shadow, and that contrast is emphasizing the interior, so that we want to go inside where that bright yellow is. And there's quite a stark contrast between the dark suits that these people are wearing and then the bright red she's wearing. Hopper often focuses on women. Sometimes he has one woman in a room. That happens. Sometimes he has males too, but the woman is often a focus, and maybe she's got shoes on and nothing else, but usually a reddish color or something to focus on her, because of the redness there. What else do we want to say about this? So the figures are kind of together but not together, and there's a line of her right arm. This is kind of creating a sort of a barrier between them. This is a really interesting piece in a lot of ways, but on a basic formal level, we're dealing with high contrast with darks and lights with values. Okay? Stylistic analysis. Artworks all have style pretty much, but sometimes the style, if we think of like Renaissance as a style, that's a lot of artists. There's hundreds of artists, probably, dozens that we know really quite well. But sometimes there's an individual style. And sometimes there's a shared smaller group. Like you get in the 20th century, the Cubists, that's a pretty small group of people. It's not as big as sort of the Renaissance would be with, everybody all over Europe using these Renaissance ideals and styles. But it really varies more and more in the art world contemporary to today. Style is very individualistic. There really isn't a lot of shared style. Okay, so if we look at Bosch, which is, I'll tell you this funny thing. My boss, our department chair, had this as a puzzle, and I did it over Christmas, and it was amazing because it really made me look at it more than I really ever have. And I've actually been to the Prado. That's where it is. It's in Madrid, Spain, which is kind of interesting because he's Northern European, and this ended up in Spain. I guess, if you think of the Inquisition, of course it would be there. But at any rate, it's highly stylistic. It's smack in the middle of the Renaissance, but it really doesn't have any of the Renaissance, well, not any, but it doesn't have a lot of characteristics of the Renaissance. It has a bit of atmospheric perspective, like our sort of bluish distant hills back there, and more focus in the foreground. But it really doesn't have 1 point or 2 point perspective. It's kind of strange. The figures aren't realistic. Very fantastical. It really looks like a surrealist piece from 400 and about 430 years later, which we're going to look at as well. But it's very individualistic, this style. He came up with it all by himself. He's the only one. So it's a fantastical meaning, not real. Not. Some people use fantastic to mean, oh, that's so great, but it also means it's not real or non-reality. So all these humans and fruits are very distorted and strange, and they're mingled in these autoerotic and nonsensical ways. In terms of iconography, we get into that a little bit different. Usually in religious artworks, like Buddhist artworks, Islamic artworks, you get into that with Christian artworks. Iconographic analysis is really important to know. It's really hard if you're outside of that culture or time period to really understand some of the meanings of the objects, but we will get into that a little bit. So this particular piece, Hans Holbein the Younger, The Ambassadors, really interesting piece. And I mean, you could study this about a half a semester and still not know everything you need to know. This is a Renaissance piece. So Hans Holbein is in England, and he was in the King Henry VIII. He was in his court, And these two fellows, Hans Holbein is German. These two fellows are French, and they were ambassadors living in England at the time. And he wanted to sort of portray all the things going on. It's sort of a snapshot of the culture at the time. So this is right. Henry VIII is responsible for the break between the Catholic Church and Protestantism, the beginning of that. And so you'll see some little tiny um, details. I'm going to skip ahead just really quick. Oh, yes. Okay, so both of these, the hidden cross here, that is giving us the concealed crucifix. Really hard to see, so I'm going to go backward. It's so tiny. Look how tiny that is. So there's all these little hidden things, or what we would call nowadays Easter eggs. There's all these interesting, strange things in this book. So that's an indication of the difficulties between the churches. And then the lute with this broken string is alluding to the discord. I mean, you can barely see this in the regular sized painting. This is so detailed, by the way, and so well crafted. It's just mind boggling how beautiful this painting is. So look at, you can barely see that. You'd really have to look up close. It is a large painting. It is 6 feet high by 6 feet wide. It's almost a square, perfect square. So it's quite a large piece. There are many other details here, including the birth date of our fellow here, Dintevel here. His birth date is on this piece here. Our other fellow here, the